I think it's incredibly difficult at the moment to have any conversation around any hot topic. And I think that's because people have become entrenched. Society's so polarized at the moment. You're either on this camp or that camp.
Hello everyone and welcome to Not the Easy Way. My name is Dr. Peter DeLima and I'm here with the lovely Dr. Claire McGuiggan. Today our very special guest is Calvin Robinson. Calvin Robinson was a previous computer science teacher, assistant principal and school governor. Currently, he is responsible for education policy at Policy Exchange, which is an educational charity, and he is often on our screens as a political commentator. In that role, Calvin is often engaging in difficult conversations in which people have different perspectives and then naturally may disagree. He recently came to the attention of Not the Easy Way when he coped well with a difficult interaction in which it was implied that Calvin should think and act in a certain way because of his race. We hope that he can help the listeners today to be able to manage the difficult conversations that they may encounter in their lives and in their communities. Without further ado, I want to welcome Calvin Robinson to the Not the Easy Way podcast. Welcome.
Dr. Peter, Dr. Claire, thank you very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you here with us, Calvin.
So we thought what we'd do is we'd start off with a little bit of an icebreaker. I give you a would you rather. Okay? Is that okay, Calvin?
Absolutely, go for it.
So, would you rather spend 365 days, a whole year, on an island alone, or with someone that constantly talks? And when I say constantly, I mean constantly. I mean as you sleep, as you eat, as you go and hunt fish. That person is there by your side, talking constantly.
I think I would rather spend a year by myself than with someone who would not stop talking. But I'm quite a lone ranger. I do like my own personal space. I like to have somewhere quiet to shut down at the end of the day, at the end of a busy day. Otherwise I would go crazy.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I get that.
Calvin, we're going to start off by asking you to share your thoughts really about how easy or difficult it is, you think, at the moment to have those difficult conversations that may be around complex or contentious issues where there are differing viewpoints. What do you think the current climate is, and how easy is it to have those conversations at the moment?
Dr. Claire, I think it's incredibly difficult at the moment to have any conversation around any hot topic. And I think that's because people have become entrenched. Society's so polarized at the moment. You're either on this camp or that camp. You know, you're on that side or this side with every single topic. It doesn't seem like we have any middle ground anymore. We seem to have lost a sense of nuance. And I think it's up to all of us to regain that and to re-engage, which is why things like this is so important, to have conversations and to learn to respect other people's points of views. And I think it does come down to respect, because quite often, you know, I'm in politics myself, and quite often in politics, we all want the same thing at the end of the day. We all want this country to be a better place, or the world to be a better place, but we have different ideas on how to get there. That's the only difference between the political parties. No one is truly evil. No one is truly bad. It's not good versus bad. It's just different ideas to make the place better for everybody. And I think we forget that quite often. If we showed respect to our opponents more often and thought, yeah, they do want to achieve the same goals that we want, they just have different angles of getting there, then we'd all come at it from a better position.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about it not being between good and bad, because that does often, that seems to what it comes down to, isn't it? That it's viewed that people that think like me, whichever side that might be on, are the good people, and we need to defend our righteousness, and I think often that kind of comes into it against people who might think differently. It's interesting you use the word respect though, because I know was it Cambridge Union a couple of months ago, didn't they had a vote on whether they should respect other views or tolerate I think it was the wording that was going to be used, wasn't it? And it actually came down to tolerating. So even if you decide you can't respect another person's view, it's an important value to think that we should tolerate that. And I think, that's maybe some of that tolerating is being lost.
I was just going to say, I think we hit the nail on the head there with the whole right versus wrong thing, because we assume that our view is right because we hold it, and we feel like we're morally superior because we hold that view, and we don't think we're bad people automatically, usually. So by default, we assume that the opposing viewpoint is wrong or bad. And I think we have to second guess ourselves more and think, actually, am I wrong in this? Am I, coming at this in the right approach? Is there a better way? And maybe we'll take a few things from the opposition's argument. Maybe we won't, but if we question ourselves, that's the right approach, I think, rather than assuming everyone who opposes us is bad or evil, because that's not the case, clearly.
So I suppose you're kind of saying that actually by not having those conversations and not challenging that view of good versus evil, we might actually miss out on something. We might miss out on learning something, or actually, I suppose, having a conversation that brings about a new understanding of something as well.
Absolutely, because as Dr. Clare said, we need to tolerate different views, and that's how we learn whether our views are right or wrong ourselves, and that's how we learn to improve our views or to get a better way of articulating what we want to say in our argument. And if we are putting forward something that we think will make something better for someone, whether that's politics or anything else, if we're trying to make improvements in the world, we want to put our argument across as articulate as possible. And to do that, we have to understand the pros and the cons of our argument in order to persuade people that our way is the better way to do it.
Yeah,
because it's interesting that the idea that we should challenge ourselves about our position, constantly reflecting on our own position around, well, why would somebody think a different way? And maybe they have got something that I would learn from that. Maybe I am wrong. But that can only be done, really, can't it, by having those, what we're terming difficult conversations, but by exposing yourself to those differing viewpoints and considering them and actually weighing them up.
We have to do that ourselves. We can't expect other people. We can't say, why are they not listening to my view? Why aren't they understanding my argument? We have to understand theirs. That's the only way this works.
So it's almost understanding first, and maybe there's a tendency to try to get other people to understand what I'm saying first. But you're kind of saying listen and understand first, and then move from there, maybe. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's how we avoid arguing a different point to what someone else is suggesting. So we often argue past each other. I could be saying something and the person I'm arguing with is saying something completely different, and we're not understanding the core premise of what each other's saying, so we're never going to reach a compromise. So if we actually stop and listen and take on board their points, that's the best way to kind of really truly understand what they're saying and get our message across in reverse.
Yeah. And I suppose I was wondering, Calvin, can you think of a time where you faced a difficult conversation or had to engage in a difficult conversation topic? And would you mind kind of telling us about that and how maybe you've used some of the things that you've described just now to navigate that effectively?
Yeah, just this week I recorded a documentary for Sky Television with the brother of Stephen Lawrence. And obviously this is around race, and this is obviously a very emotive topic anyway. People get very passionate about the debate. But I was recording this with a person of national interest, or a story of national interest. And I have to remember that just because I have a personal stake in this, and just because I have a personal opinion, doesn't mean it's right. And therefore, I have to come at it with an element of compassion, because it's an argument, or it's a conversation that brings up feelings in people anyway. And when it's a topic that's gained national attention and it's around people's lives and lost lives, it's even more emotive than usual. So it's coming at this from a point of not just understanding but empathy, and trying to consider what the opposition might be feeling, not just what they understand the argument to be, before putting your argument across. And that is very difficult, because when all sides are passionate about what they believe, it's very difficult to kind of bring it down a level, but I think that's very important.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what you've said, Calvin, because I suppose it's the idea that when we're coming to these conversations, especially around difficult topics and emotive topics, I suppose what you're saying is that it's important to really acknowledge where that other person is at in that moment, what emotions they might be feeling. And so we might want to share our view or our perspective, but we also need to be mindful of how that might be received, and how, and I suppose how we need to phrase things, and how we and the way in which we say things. And I suppose, with that said, I wondered, is there a tension there? Is there a difficulty when actually sometimes we have a view that might be received in an uncompassionate way?
Absolutely, I think there is. So another instance, I was on a radio debate not too long ago. You mentioned it in your introduction, and the person I was arguing with, we were on completely different planes. We were coming at the argument from a completely different level, and it was getting quite heated, quite passionate. And I think, I mentioned compassion, but it's also important to not let the passion turn into anger, and to monitor that. So I thought that I came across quite cross, quite angry in that video, in my response, because I felt like I was being shut down, and I felt like my opponent was using ad hominem attacks. I thought they were being racist towards me, and in that moment I could no longer consider their perspective and where they were coming from and why they were so upset, why they were feeling so emotive about the argument. All I could see was my red line, and my red line was, they've crossed the barrier from arguing facts, figures, data into being personal, and it felt like a personal attack on me. Therefore, my stance was to shut down that debate. I'm no longer happy to have that conversation. So there is a point where we absolutely need to find the middle ground and try to engage in an area that we can both share a language and share a level of passion without it getting too heated. But at the same time, we have to have sensible red lines where, if the debate is reaching a point where actually nothing's going to be gained from this because it's gone too far, it's better to walk away than to take it to an extreme.
It's interesting there, because you've talked in those two different examples both about the emotion that comes into discussing these complex and different issues where there are possibly very differing perspectives, and just having those differing perspectives can create real emotion on both sides, and you need to be aware of both possibly what you're provoking in somebody else and how far in different situations you might feel is appropriate to go with that, because I think that's something else that you need to think about, because sometimes that can be used to shut down. You're upsetting me, so therefore you mustn't give your point of view, but versus you making that judgment that actually in this situation the sensitivity for this other person means that I do need to think very carefully about how I express this view, how far I go with this, whether I decide this is the time and place to have this conversation in this way.
Yeah.
We've lost all sense of common ground once we've reached too much emotion. And I don't believe in censorship, but I believe in self-censorship. So if we think we're triggering or offending someone to a point that they're no longer able to engage with us on a reasonable level, then we need to kind of consider our next point of conversation. And likewise, on the other foot, we have to consider, are we taking offense at what someone's intended to say or what they've actually said? And I think intent comes into it quite often too, in that quite often people aren't trying to offend us, they're trying to put across their view in the only way that they know how, and sometimes the offence can be perceived on our side where maybe it wasn't intended, and therefore again, it's not coming down to that person being bad, it's coming down to bad communication. So maybe readjust the language that we're using in the conversation so that we can again find that common ground, and it can be reasonable and reasoned rather than heated.
So Calvin, having said that, what would your advice be to young people if they were listening to this and thinking, yeah, I've been trying to have conversations around some of these issues, they seem to go in the way that you're describing, where either I'm getting I get very offended by what people say, and so I don't want to speak to them, or conversely, I try and tell people what I think, but they shout me down. What advice would you give to them to try and take this approach that you're advocating?
I think the best advice I could give is to focus on the facts, the data, the information. Try and look for the truth in an argument. Try to take your emotion out of it. I know that's very difficult, but try to take your emotion out and forget about what you feel and talk about what you know. And the best way to not take offense or to not cause offense is to not try to persuade people. Share your information with them and let them share theirs with you. It's not about winning via persuading, because that very rarely happens when you're trying, because it comes across as you're trying to force your views on someone else. Just share the facts, the information, and the truth with the other person and let them do the same to you.
There's almost a safety there in essence, because you're saying, let me look at the information, let me look at the facts and the evidence, and then let me share that. And it isn't for me to persuade you to think differently, because actually that can be quite emotional, really. If I'm trying to persuade someone to think a certain way and then they're not thinking the way I want them to think, actually that could be quite frustrating.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think one of our strengths is admitting when we're wrong, and people think it's a weakness, but it's such a strength in a debate. If you hear something that proves you wrong and you admit to that, that gives so much strength to your argument, because people appreciate that you are actually arguing for the truth and you're actually trying to put across all of the data, the information, and the facts to help improve the case that you're putting forward, and you're not just pushing an emotive stance that you happen to believe, and therefore you're not willing to compromise in any way, shape or form. So admitting when you're wrong, and even apologizing if it's an offense that you've caused in being wrong, and then if you're on the other end of that argument, forgiveness, of course. If someone says or does something wrong, if somebody apologizes, the next step is always to forgive.
Yeah, I wonder whether one of the issues that maybe you're experiencing, in the beginning when you were saying that these conversations, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have these conversations, is that this idea of truth and presenting facts to each other, that there's people don't necessarily want to engage in that listening to you, that exchange of, this is something that I understand, and presenting some facts, versus something, well, this is actually something I understand, and presenting those facts and then considering those. And I think one of the ways that, again, going back to the kind of the speak chart and lots of the things that you're saying, I'm thinking, yes, those are things on our speak charter that we produce for young people to use in schools to support them, is to, and you mentioned it in the beginning, Calvin, is to really listen to what the other person's saying. So have your, be ready with your explanation, but actually listen to what they're saying. And one of the key things that we thought about when we were doing the speak charter is ask them questions to build your understanding of what they're saying. So really listen, and then if you're thinking, but that doesn't make sense to me because I think in this way, well, ask them some questions to explain why they think that. So they might just present the facts, but then ask more questions. So spend time listening and exploring what they think. We started, the first question was about, how easy or difficult do you think it is nowadays? And you kind of said it's incredibly difficult because of this polarization, this good-bad dynamic. Why do you feel it's getting worse? And if so, why? And how optimistic do you feel that we can that there are people having the sorts of conversations that you want to have and thinking the way you think to get it moving back in the other direction?
I think it is getting worse because of this whole idea of no platforming, which started in the students' unions of all places. This idea that if someone says something that you find offensive, you shut them down and you don't engage with them, you don't debate with them because they're naturally wrong and they're evil and bad. Whereas, as we've discussed in this chat, the best thing to do is to challenge views and debate them and find out, okay, they might be wrong, but to engage with them and let them know why they're wrong. But you also might learn elements about them that are not wrong and that you want to take on board. And free speech is the key to an open, thriving democracy, in my opinion. So we should always have access to open and free debate.
Why might young people today, in your opinion, why might young people today maybe not agree with that, not agree that free speech and freedom of expression is really, really important in society? I just wondered what your kind of thoughts on that were.
So like we talked about offence earlier, and some people genuinely believe that if something is offensive, it shouldn't be said. But the problem there is that offence is so subjective that anyone could be offended by anything if they choose to take offence. Some things are obviously much more offensive than others, but sometimes it's not the case that it's obvious, and it comes down to, for me, intention or the intent of the person making the statement. So if someone is trying to be offensive or they're using a term in a derogatory way, of course that is a different conversation than when someone is just using their natural everyday language and someone happens to find it offensive. That's a very different scenario. And we don't seem to have a differentiation between the two anymore. We kind of bracket all offence into one bubble and say offence is bad, we mustn't do it. And again, we don't know if something's offensive or not unless we have a conversation about it. So that's why we have to debate these things and say, is this offensive or is it just offensive to some people? Does that matter? Is that important? If it is, fair enough. But we need to engage with it first and foremost.
Okay, so I think we'll leave that there now. Thank you, Calvin, so much for your time, for coming in and having this important conversation with us around supporting young people to have these difficult conversations around complex issues. We feel it's an important thing for us to think about and to promote for young people, and we really appreciate you giving your time to come and support young people with us. So thank you so much. If anybody wants to find you or follow you, how can they do that?
Dr. Claire, Dr. Peter, thank you for the invitation. It's been fantastic. It's been really good to talk to you. If people want to follow me, just Google Calvin Robinson. You can find me on Twitter, Telegram, Facebook, whatever. Just Google.
You'll just come up. Yeah. Google you. Okay. That's great. Okay. Thank you once again, Calvin. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Calvin. Hello, everybody. You've just been listening to Not the Easy Way with Calvin Robinson. We're going to leave you with a few questions to discuss amongst yourselves. The first one revisits what we talked about with Calvin at the very start of the podcast, which is, would you rather? So, take a little moment to think. Would you rather spend 365 days alone on an island, or with a person that constantly talks for those 365 days? So that means when you're sleeping, when you're eating, when you're drinking, when you're gathering your food.
So one of the things that we think you could think about is, why is it important to have conversations with people who think differently to you?
And the second question we'd like you to consider is it ever okay to cause offence?
And the last question that you might want to discuss is, what could you do when you find yourself in a conversation where people disagree?
So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy engaging in an interesting conversation around the questions we've put to you today. And please make sure to follow us on social media and look forward to the next episode of Not the Easy Way.